Well, good morning, Lions and Emperors too. It's good to see you today. Well, at least get to see you on camera anyway. Today we're going to be taking a look at David Livingston, so let's go ahead and pray and then we will begin. Father, today as we work through a new way of doing education, I pray for your grace to be upon us all. I pray that you will enable us to work together, to learn, and to grow in the grace and knowledge of you. I thank you for my students. Lord, bless them and protect them and give them much grace and mercy today and give them great joy. It's in your name I pray, Jesus. I love you. Amen. So David Livingston, that's the one we're looking at today. So if you haven't downloaded the notes, you need to go ahead and do that right now and print them out. But in 1813, David Livingston was born March the 19th in a grimy industrial town near Glasgow, Scotland. His family, parents of 2 brothers and 2 sisters, as well as David, lived in a one-room tenement. So you got 2, 4, 6, 7 people living in one room. He was greatly influenced by his grandfather, Neil Sr., who entranced him with stories of adventure from around the world. In 1823, David went to work in a cotton mill, and despite 14-hour days, he also attended 2 hours of classes in Latin, Greek, theology, and the classical poets of Virgil, etc. He loved books so much his first paycheck went to buy a Latin grammar book. I think I went to the grocery store and bought comic books, candy, soda pop, that kind of thing. He would prop the book up on a machine, and each time he passed by it, he would read a line or two, and that's how he taught himself to read Latin and Greek. His father used to hand out tracts when he went door to door selling tea. And he was a member of the Reformed Church, a Calvinist, and so he preached the gospel. He believed fully in the sovereignty of God, that God could save whoever he wanted to. And so he preached the gospel to everybody. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creatures. That's going to come back to help David as he becomes a missionary. His dad disapproved of trashy novels, which were pretty much anything that was not religious, and also science books. He believed the latter to be ungodly, not ladders, but like the later. Okay, you get what I'm talking about. He did permit David to read books like Robinson Crusoe, which only stoked the fires to go elsewhere in the world besides Scotland. David's life was changed by the writings of Thomas Dick, who was kind of eccentric, but he was a Scottish theologian, amateur astronomer, and he believed that both science and religion were revelators of God in the world. After reading one of Thomas Dick's books, Livingston noted, "Immediately I accepted salvation by Christ, and I vowed to devote my life to his service." After reading an appeal for medical missionaries to China, David immediately said, I could unite my scientific study with my Christian faith, and he convinced his father to let him become a doctor. 14 years or 14-hour days in a cotton mill does not prepare you to be a doctor, but God indeed does. So with no real formal learning, he enrolled in college to study medicine, theology, and science. In 1837, he applied to the London Missionary Society. China had become a closed nation due to the opium wars that were going on there, so David turned his attention to an equally dark continent of Africa. Within 6 months, he met a man named Robert Moffat, who was a veteran missionary to Africa, and he thrilled him with stories about what was going on in his mission in southern Africa. He said, "I can see the smoke of 1,000 fires in 1,000 villages where no missionary has gone before." We're going to find out that Mr. Moffat wasn't necessarily the most honest individual when it comes to that kind of thing. But in 1840, he was ordained and medically certified, so he left for Africa, and he also said that he would not return for 16 years. The voyage, which first went to Brazil, was quite rough, and David described it as a ship that was unfit for epilepsy. I met a man at a comic book store in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, who had epilepsy, and he had a seizure one day when I was in there, and it was pretty difficult. The man would get into some pretty severe twitches and convulsions and so forth. And if David Livingston uses epilepsy to describe it, this was a rough voyage indeed. 3 months later, he arrived in Cape Town, South Africa, made his way by ox cart, that's not fast, for Moffat's mission station in Kuruman, which was 600 miles, that's crazy talk. North, it's on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. Kuruman was somewhat of a paradise on earth because after 25 years of ministry by Robert Moffat in that location, This place had basically become like Club Med. If you have no idea what that is, look it up. But it was basically like a resort right there on the edge of the desert. He had built a dam, and with irrigation, he was able to plant like a grove of fruit trees of various kinds. There was a stone church. There were neat rows of houses, but the houses did not look an awful lot like African houses. They looked a lot more like British houses. So you're kind of redoing Africa in the image of Britain. Unfortunately, the smoke of 1,000 villages was kind of exaggerated because in 25 years of missions there in Africa, Moffat had about 40 converts. Many of those were now apostate. Whatever faith they professed, they no longer professed to have that faith. So there were very few people in the surrounding area, so that's part of the problem, is that you're in a place, you got this great location, you got great facilities. On the other hand, you don't have many converts to show for it. So Livingston was so disappointed, he decided to explore the region. So he and another missionary made the first attempt at exploring Africa, a part of Africa that was unknown to white people. And so for 10 years, David did normal missions work. He would go find people. He would start learning the language. He would start preaching the gospel to them in their own language. And so he opened up several mission stations in the bush. In essence, he was like their pastor, and he would be training folks to do their own pastoring. He didn't want to be the pastor of Africans. He wanted Africans to be the pastor to Africans. In 1844, he married Robert Moffat's daughter, Mary. And despite getting married to Mary, the man was a little bit restless. He was bored, and he longed to keep going further, still further into the night. One of my favorite quotes from David Livingston. He said, "The mere animal pleasure of traveling in a wild, unexplored country is very great." Woo, spicy. His only convert to date had returned to his native polygamy. Kind of discouraging to David. But he was impressed with the early discoveries that he had made in regards to the land. Very intrigued by Africa's rivers. Not exactly sure where they went or how navigable they were, but he believed that these would be integral to stopping the slave trade. He wanted to take the gospel up these rivers as far as he could go on each one of them. He wanted to explore them, take the gospel there, and see if he couldn't put an end to this terrible practice of the slavers. In his first term in Africa, Livingston made some of his most dangerous journeys. In fact, they were some of the most dangerous journeys of the whole 1800s. He's actually going to become pretty famous for missions, absolutely, but he's going to become well known for his explorations. The natives knew where all these rivers went, but the white folks, they did not. His object was to open a missionary road. He sometimes called it God's Highway, 1,500 miles north and inland. But love David Livingston. Don't get me wrong. I'm not casting shade at him or throwing shade or whatever I do with shade. I'm not doing that. But these journeys also revealed that David had kind of a weird side. He could not get along well with Westerners. Africans? Absolutely. He spent a lot of time with them. 16 years it's been since he really had spent time with Westerners, so he couldn't really get along well with them. He didn't just get them. They didn't vibe together and stuff like that. He disputed with other missionaries and family members, and the guy could hold a grudge. The guy's not perfect. I'm not saying he's like Superman in morality. I'm just saying that he could definitely hold a grudge. He preferred books to people. I kind of get that. He preferred books to people and usually would say very little until provoked. I don't get that. He hated being among missionaries who viewed themselves as patrons to the poor, pitiful Africans. And he also opposed the colonization of Africa. When Livingston was preaching against racial intolerance, the white Afrikaners tried to burn him out of his mission station and also tried to steal his animals. Apparently the gospel didn't get to these guys yet either. So when he preached this way, though, the Africans loved him. They loved his curiosity, and they loved his guns. Yeah, they had no problem with weapons. He used them to protect them, so there are very much good uses for these weapons, and they loved them. More than anything else, though, David spoke with them with respect. He didn't talk down to them. He treated them as though they were his equals. And when we speak in terms of missions and sharing the gospel, we have to recognize the intelligence and the experiences and the lives of the people. Recognize that these are intelligent, precious beings in the eyes of God. Most of the missionaries at that time did not. They looked at them as being poor, pitiful, uneducated, awful, backwards people. Livingston did not treat them at all that way. He was often welcomed into the villages as a visiting dignitary. His reputation preceded him, and so whenever he would show up at these villages, they would welcome him. They were very happy. He'd often welcomed Africans into his home, showed them great respect and honor, and they returned the favor. He said, Africans are not by any means... This sounds so much better if I had a Scottish accent, but I don't. Africans are not by any means unreasonable. I think unreasonableness is a disease of Europe. In 1849, he led the first known Europeans to reach Lake Ngami, which is called the Lake Ngami, the lake beyond the desert. And he was accompanied by William Oswell, who was a wealthy soldier and a big game hunter. Mary accompanied David as well on many of these early trips. Later on, when she's on the nest and they're making babies together, she didn't want to go nearly as often, for obvious reasons. Being a missionary kid, she was accustomed to the hardships of living in Africa, but David pushed her into difficulties she never imagined. Why you would ever do this, I don't know, but Mary decided she would go with her husband on a missionary trip into the Kalahari, and so her newborn baby died. Why would you take a newborn baby into the Kalahari? I don't know, but she did. And they wandered into the Kalahari desert for a month with limited water. Sad day. 1852, after 7 years of marriage, David took Mary and their children to Cape Town. It was his first visit to civilization in 11 years. He sent them back to England, and he didn't see them again for 4 years. That would be like me sending my wife and family to Pennsylvania when Grayson began his freshman year, and I wouldn't see them again until after Grayson graduated from high school. I couldn't handle that. That would be very rough. Though they were separated for years at a time, they had 6 children. Made good use of the time when they were together. Spassy. Though they were separated for years at a time, they had 6 children in 17 years of marriage. And after he sent them home, he made a 3-year trip from coast to coast. He was likely the first white man who ever did this. He would take one river in from one side and maybe have to portage over to another one, but he crossed the continent of Africa using the river. So his God's highway was definitely a thing. The missionary road was there if they would use it that way. And during his final trip on this 1,700-mile long journey, the Zambezi River, that's what he was on, by the way. It's the 26th longest river in the world. And so when he made this trip along this river, he reached a place called Victoria Falls. You've probably heard of it. It's one of the greatest discoveries ever by the Westerners. And when we pick up our lesson in David Livingston Part 2, we'll show you what happened after that. So we will see you tomorrow. God bless you all. Love you.